Over the next 3 days, Sarah immersed herself in academy life. She attended classes, observed training exercises, and conducted interviews with cadets and faculty members, her notebook filled with observations about the rigid hierarchy and unspoken rules that governed every aspect of daily routine. The Academy's public relations team had arranged a carefully orchestrated schedule of interviews with hand-picked personnel who could speak positively about recent reforms. But Sarah had learned long ago how to read between the lines and find the stories that officials preferred to keep hidden. During a lunch break in the cadet dining hall, she noticed a young woman sitting alone at a corner table. Cadet Jennifer Walsh, a second-year student from Ohio, kept her eyes down as she ate, seeming deliberately isolated from her classmates. Sarah's journalistic instincts told her there was a story here. Approaching carefully, Sarah introduced herself and asked if she could sit down. Jennifer looked up with startled eyes, clearly surprised that someone was showing interest in talking with her. After glancing around nervously to see who might be watching, she nodded reluctantly. As they talked, Jennifer's story slowly emerged. She had been one of the top performers in her class during her first year, excelling in both academics and physical training. But everything changed when she reported a male upperclassman for sexual harassment. Instead of receiving support, she found herself facing increased scrutiny from instructors and social isolation from her peers. Jennifer spoke in hushed tones, explaining how her grades had mysteriously started to suffer after filing the complaint. Training exercises that she had previously mastered suddenly became impossible to pass. Her requests for meetings with the administration were either denied or resulted in lectures about maintaining unit cohesion and not causing unnecessary disruptions. Sarah listened with growing anger as Jennifer described months of systematic retaliation disguised as normal military discipline. The young cadet had gone from being a promising officer candidate to someone who was barely hanging on, constantly threatened with dismissal for failing to meet standards that seemed to shift whenever she showed improvement. The harassment case itself had been quietly closed. After a perfunctory investigation that concluded there was insufficient evidence to support Jennifer's claims. The male cadet she had accused received no punishment and continued to thrive in the academy environment, while Jennifer found herself treated as a troublemaker who had made false accusations. As Jennifer spoke, tears began to form in her eyes. She explained how she had dreamed of serving her country since childhood, inspired by her grandfather who had been a decorated Navy officer. The academy had been her pathway to that dream, but now she felt trapped in a nightmare with no way out. Sarah asked Jennifer if she would be willing to go on the record with her story. The young cadet's face went pale at the suggestion. She explained that speaking to a journalist could result in immediate expulsion for violating the academy's media policies. Even this conversation could get her in serious trouble if the wrong people found out about it. After Jennifer left to return to afternoon classes, Sarah sat alone in the dining hall, processing what she had learned. This was exactly the kind of story she had suspected she would find, but hearing the details firsthand made her more determined than ever to expose the truth. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected visit in her guest quarters. A knock at the door revealed Sergeant Major Patricia Coleman, a career military woman with 22 years of service. Coleman looked around nervously before entering the room and closing the door behind her. The sergeant major had heard about Sarah's conversation with Jennifer Walsh. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit academy community, and several staff members had noticed the journalist spending time with the troubled cadet. Coleman had come to provide context that she felt Sarah needed to understand. Coleman explained that Jennifer's case was not unique. Over the past 3 years, she had watched several promising female cadets face similar retaliation after reporting harassment or discrimination. The Academy's official policies looked progressive on paper, but the reality on the ground was very different. The sergeant major described a culture where reporting misconduct was seen as betrayal of the military brotherhood. Female cadets who spoke up were labeled as weak or attention-seeking, while those who stayed silent were rewarded with opportunities for advancement. The message was clear: conform to the existing system or face the consequences. Coleman had tried to support cadets like Jennifer through official channels, but her efforts were consistently blocked by higher-ranking officers who viewed such complaints as threats to the Academy's reputation. She had documented numerous cases of discrimination and retaliation, but her reports disappeared into administrative black holes where they could be safely ignored. As a woman who had succeeded in the military despite facing her own challenges, Coleman felt a responsibility to speak up for the next generation. But she also knew that going public with her concerns could end her career just 2 years short of retirement. She was taking an enormous risk by talking to Sarah. The sergeant major handed Sarah a manila envelope containing copies of incident reports, email exchanges, and other documentation that painted a clear picture of systemic problems within the academy. She asked only that Sarah protect her identity and find a way to tell the story that would create real change rather than just another scandal that would blow over in a few weeks. After Coleman left, Sarah spread the documents across her small desk and began to piece together a pattern of abuse that went far beyond what she had initially suspected. The evidence showed a deliberate effort to silence whistleblowers and protect perpetrators, all while maintaining a public facade of progress and reform. As she worked late into the night, Sarah thought about her encounter with General Hayes. His refusal to acknowledge her as an equal suddenly seemed like a microcosm of the larger problems plaguing the institution he commanded. The disrespect she had experienced was nothing compared to what female cadets faced every day, but it was all part of the same toxic culture that viewed women as outsiders, who needed to prove their worth in ways that men never did. Over the next 3 days, Sarah immersed herself in academy life. She attended classes, observed training exercises, and conducted interviews with cadets and faculty members. Her notebook filled with observations about the rigid hierarchy and unspoken rules that governed every aspect of daily routine. The Academy's public relations team had arranged a carefully orchestrated schedule of interviews with hand-picked personnel who could speak positively about recent reforms. But Sarah had learned long ago how to read between the lines and find the stories that officials preferred to keep hidden. During a lunch break in the cadet dining hall, she noticed a young woman sitting alone at a corner table. Cadet Jennifer Walsh, a second-year student from Ohio, kept her eyes down as she ate, seeming deliberately isolated from her classmates. Sarah's journalistic instincts told her there was a story here. Approaching carefully, Sarah introduced herself and asked if she could sit down. Jennifer looked up with startled eyes, clearly surprised that someone was showing interest in talking with her. After glancing around nervously to see who might be watching, she nodded reluctantly. As they talked, Jennifer's story slowly emerged. She had been one of the top performers in her class during her first year, excelling in both academics and physical training. But everything changed when she reported a male upperclassman for sexual harassment. Instead of receiving support, she found herself facing increased scrutiny from instructors and social isolation from her peers. Jennifer spoke in hushed tones, explaining how her grades had mysteriously started to suffer after filing the complaint. Training exercises that she had previously mastered suddenly became impossible to pass. Her requests for meetings with the administration were either denied or resulted in lectures about maintaining unit cohesion and not causing unnecessary disruptions. Sarah listened with growing anger as Jennifer described months of systematic retaliation disguised as normal military discipline. The young cadet had gone from being a promising officer candidate to someone who was barely hanging on, constantly threatened with dismissal for failing to meet standards that seemed to shift whenever she showed improvement. The harassment case itself had been quietly closed. After a perfunctory investigation that concluded there was insufficient evidence to support Jennifer's claims, the male cadet she had accused received no punishment and continued to thrive in the academy environment, while Jennifer found herself treated as a troublemaker who had made false accusations. As Jennifer spoke, tears began to form in her eyes. She explained how she had dreamed of serving her country since childhood, inspired by her grandfather who had been a decorated Navy officer. The academy had been her pathway to that dream, but now she felt trapped in a nightmare with no way out. Sarah asked Jennifer if she would be willing to go on the record with her story. The young cadet's face went pale at the suggestion. She explained that speaking to a journalist could result in immediate expulsion for violating the academy's media policies. Even this conversation could get her in serious trouble if the wrong people found out about it. After Jennifer left to return to afternoon classes, Sarah sat alone in the dining hall, processing what she had learned. This was exactly the kind of story she had suspected she would find. But hearing the details firsthand made her more determined than ever to expose the truth. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected visit in her guest quarters. A knock at the door revealed Sergeant Major Patricia Coleman, a career military woman with 22 years of service. Coleman looked around nervously before entering the room and closing the door behind her. The sergeant major had heard about Sarah's conversation with Jennifer Walsh. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit academy community, and several staff members had noticed the journalist spending time with the troubled cadet. Coleman had come to provide context that she felt Sarah needed to understand. Coleman explained that Jennifer's case was not unique. Over the past 3 years, she had watched several promising female cadets face similar retaliation after reporting harassment or discrimination. The Academy's official policies looked progressive on paper, but the reality on the ground was very different. The sergeant major described a culture where reporting misconduct was seen as betrayal of the military brotherhood. Female cadets who spoke up were labeled as weak or attention-seeking, while those who stayed silent were rewarded with opportunities for advancement. The message was clear: conform to the existing system or face the consequences. Coleman had tried to support cadets like Jennifer through official channels, but her efforts were consistently blocked by higher-ranking officers who viewed such complaints as threats to the Academy's reputation. She had documented numerous cases of discrimination and retaliation, but her reports disappeared into administrative black holes where they could be safely ignored. As a woman who had succeeded in the military despite facing her own challenges, Coleman felt a responsibility to speak up for the next generation. But she also knew that going public with her concerns could end her career just 2 years short of retirement. She was taking an enormous risk by talking to Sarah. The sergeant major handed Sarah a manila envelope containing copies of incident reports, email exchanges, and other documentation that painted a clear picture of systemic problems within the Academy. She asked only that Sarah protect her identity and find a way to tell the story that would create real change rather than just another scandal that would blow over in a few weeks. After Coleman left, Sarah spread the documents across her small desk and began to piece together a pattern of abuse that went far beyond what she had initially suspected. The evidence showed a deliberate effort to silence whistleblowers and protect perpetrators, all while maintaining a public facade of progress and reform. As she worked late into the night, Sarah thought about her encounter with General Hayes. His refusal to acknowledge her as an equal suddenly seemed like a microcosm of the larger problems plaguing the institution he commanded. The disrespect she had experienced was nothing compared to what female cadets faced every day, but it was all part of the same toxic culture that viewed women as outsiders who needed to prove their worth in ways that men never did. The next morning brought unexpected developments. Sarah woke to find a message slipped under her door, requesting her immediate presence at General Hayes's office. The tone was formal and commanding, leaving no room for negotiation about timing or alternatives. As she walked across the courtyard, Sarah noticed that several cadets and faculty members watched her with obvious concern. Word had spread about her conversations with Jennifer Walsh and others who had shared their stories. The Academy's leadership was clearly aware that she was digging deeper than her official assignment required. General Hayes was not alone when she arrived at his office. Beside him stood Colonel David Morrison, the Academy's chief legal officer, and Major Susan Carter from the Public Affairs Department. The presence of legal counsel made it clear that this was not going to be a casual conversation. The general's demeanor was even more rigid than during their first encounter. He remained standing behind his desk while his subordinates flanked him on either side. The arrangement was clearly designed to intimidate, with Sarah facing 3 senior officers who controlled every aspect of life at the Academy. Colonel Morrison opened the conversation by informing Sarah that several cadets had reported feeling harassed by her questioning. He claimed that her interviews were disrupting the normal educational environment and causing unnecessary stress among the student body. The implication was clear. She was overstepping the boundaries of her agreed-upon access. Sarah listened calmly to the accusations while mentally preparing her response. She had expected this kind of pushback once her real investigation became apparent. Military institutions were notorious for closing ranks when faced with external scrutiny, especially from journalists with a reputation for exposing uncomfortable truths. When the colonel finished his prepared statement, Sarah responded with professional composure. She pointed out that all of her interviews had been voluntary and conducted with full transparency about her role as a journalist. She had followed every protocol established by the Public Affairs Office and had made no attempt to coerce anyone into speaking with her. Major Carter interjected with concerns about potential violations of cadet privacy rights. She suggested that Sarah's line of questioning went beyond the scope of her approved story about diversity programs and entered sensitive areas that could compromise ongoing administrative processes. The implication was that discussing harassment cases violated some form of confidentiality agreement. Sarah challenged this assertion by noting that she had been granted access to document the Academy's progress on inclusion and equality. Investigating barriers to that progress, including harassment and retaliation, was clearly within the scope of her assignment. She had not signed any agreements limiting her ability to speak with cadets about their experiences. Throughout this exchange, General Hayes remained silent, studying Sarah with the same cold calculation she had observed during their first meeting. His presence dominated the room even without speaking, and she could feel his disapproval radiating across the space between them. The colonel shifted tactics, suggesting that Sarah's reporting could damage the Academy's reputation and hurt recruitment efforts. He painted a picture of young people being discouraged from military service by negative publicity, potentially weakening national defense. It was an appeal to patriotism designed to make her question the value of her investigation. Sarah had heard similar arguments many times before. Officials often wrapped their desire to avoid accountability in claims about serving the greater good. She responded by pointing out that exposing problems was the first step toward solving them, and that covering up misconduct actually did more damage to military effectiveness than honest reporting ever could. As the meeting continued, Sarah realized that the three officers were following a carefully rehearsed script designed to pressure her into backing down from her investigation. They alternated between veiled threats about access restrictions and appeals to her sense of responsibility, hoping to find an approach that would make her abandon her story. The turning point came when Colonel Morrison mentioned that the Academy had the authority to revoke her credentials and escort her off the premises if her presence became disruptive to normal operations. The threat was delivered in carefully legal language, but the message was unmistakable: conform to their expectations or face immediate expulsion. Sarah felt a flash of anger at the blatant attempt at intimidation. She had dealt with similar tactics from corrupt politicians and corporate executives, but somehow the military's version felt more personal. These officers had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution, which included the freedom of the press they were now trying to suppress. She stood up slowly, matching the general's rigid posture with her own display of determination. Looking directly at Hayes, she spoke with quiet intensity about her commitment to uncovering the truth regardless of the obstacles placed in her path. She reminded them that the American people had a right to know how their tax dollars were being used to train future military leaders. The general finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command. He told Sarah that the Academy would continue to cooperate with her official assignment, but expected her to conduct herself with appropriate respect for military protocol and chain of command. The warning was clear: stay within approved boundaries or face consequences. Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave, but she paused at the door to deliver her own message. She looked back at the three officers and stated clearly that she intended to follow the story wherever it led, regardless of attempts to limit her access or intimidate her sources. She would fulfill her professional obligations as a journalist, just as they were expected to fulfill their duties as military officers. As she walked back across the courtyard, Sarah felt the weight of the confrontation settling over her. The Academy's leadership had made their position clear, but so had she. The real question now was whether she could continue her investigation while avoiding the trap they were obviously setting for her. The encounter had also revealed something important about the Academy's culture. The fact that three senior officers felt the need to gang up on a single journalist suggested they were more worried about her discoveries than they were willing to admit. Their heavy-handed approach indicated that the problems she was uncovering were even more serious than she had initially suspected. Sarah, spent the rest of the day carefully reviewing her notes and documentation, making sure everything was properly secured and backed up. She had a feeling that her time at the academy was about to become much more difficult, and she needed to be prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. That evening, Sarah received an encrypted message on her secure phone from an unknown sender. The text was brief but intriguing. Library, 3rd floor, American History section, tomorrow, 1400 hours. Come alone. A friend who wants justice. The military time format suggested the sender was someone from within the academy. Sarah spent a restless night weighing the risks of meeting an anonymous source. Her confrontation with the academy leadership had made it clear that she was being watched closely. Any suspicious activity could provide them with the excuse they needed to revoke her access and expel her from the premises. But her journalistic instincts told her this could be the breakthrough she needed. Someone inside the system wanted to help her uncover the truth, and she couldn't afford to pass up that opportunity. She decided to take the risk, planning her approach carefully to avoid detection. The next day, Sarah made a point of following her official schedule visibly, attending a briefing about cadet physical fitness standards and touring the engineering laboratories. She wanted anyone watching her to see normal, approved activities that aligned with her supposed focus on diversity programs. At exactly 1400 hours, she entered the academy library and made her way to the 3rd floor. The American History section was tucked away in a quiet corner, surrounded by tall shelves that provided natural privacy from casual observation. She browsed the books on military campaigns while waiting to see who would approach her. A few minutes later, she heard soft footsteps behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with Captain Maria Rodriguez, a young officer she had noticed during her first day at the academy. Rodriguez was one of the few female instructors in the Tactical Studies department, and Sarah had been struck by her professional competence and quiet confidence. Captain Rodriguez glanced around nervously before speaking in a low voice. She explained that she had been following Sarah's investigation and wanted to provide information that could help expose the systemic problems plaguing the academy. But she needed assurance that her identity would be protected, as speaking out could destroy her military career. The captain revealed that she had been documenting discrimination and harassment cases for over 2 years, keeping detailed records of incidents that were either ignored or covered up by the administration. She had hoped that working within the system would eventually produce reforms, but instead she had watched the problems get worse while victims were silenced or forced out. Rodriguez pulled a small flash drive from her pocket and handed it to Sarah. The device contained copies of incident reports, email exchanges between administrators, and recorded statements from cadets who had been afraid to speak publicly about their experiences. It was a treasure trove of evidence that painted a clear picture of institutional corruption. The captain explained that her decision to contact Sarah had been triggered by watching Jennifer Walsh's deteriorating situation. Rodriguez had tried to support the young cadet through official channels, but her efforts had been blocked at every turn. She couldn't stand by and watch another promising officer candidate be destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect and develop them. As they talked, Rodriguez revealed her own experiences with discrimination and retaliation. Despite her excellent performance ratings and strong leadership skills, she had been passed over for promotions while less qualified male officers advanced ahead of her. When she had raised concerns about this pattern, she had been labeled as a troublemaker and faced increased scrutiny of her work. The captain also shared disturbing information about General Hayes's role in maintaining the toxic culture. She described how the general had personally intervened to protect male officers accused of harassment, while allowing female victims to be quietly forced out of the academy. His public statements about diversity and inclusion were contradicted by his private actions to preserve the status quo. Rodriguez told Sarah about a particularly egregious case from the previous year. A female cadet had been sexually assaulted by a male upperclassman, but when she reported the crime, she faced a campaign of intimidation and harassment designed to force her to withdraw her complaint. The general had been briefed on the situation but had chosen to prioritize protecting the academy's reputation over seeking justice for the victim. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Both women quickly separated, with Rodriguez disappearing between the book stacks while Sarah continued browsing as if nothing had happened. A library security guard passed by on routine patrol, nodding politely to Sarah before continuing on his rounds. When the area was clear again, Rodriguez returned to provide final instructions about the flash drive. She explained that the files were organized by date and type of incident, with supporting documentation for each case. She had also included a summary document that outlined patterns of discrimination and retaliation across multiple departments and academic years. The captain emphasized that many of the victims documented in the files were no longer at the academy, having been forced out through various forms of pressure and retaliation. Their stories had never been told publicly, and their sacrifice in trying to improve the system had been ignored. Rodriguez hoped that Sarah's reporting could finally give voice to their experiences and create pressure for real change. Before leaving, Rodriguez warned Sarah to be extremely careful about how she used the information. The Academy's leadership would stop at nothing to prevent the truth from becoming public, and they had the resources and authority to make life very difficult for anyone who threatened their interests. She suggested that Sarah consider leaving the Academy soon and completing her investigation from a safer location. As they prepared to part ways, Sarah asked Rodriguez why she was taking such enormous risks to help her. The captain's answer was simple but powerful. She had joined the military to serve her country and uphold its values. But she couldn't do that while remaining silent about injustices happening under her nose. Someone had to speak up for the victims who had been silenced. After Rodriguez left, Sarah remained in the library for another hour, processing what she had learned and planning her next moves. The flash drive in her pocket contained enough evidence to expose the Academy's systemic problems, but she needed to verify the information and gather additional sources to strengthen her story. She also realized that her time at the Academy was running out. The leadership's growing hostility toward her investigation meant that she would likely face escalating pressure to leave. She needed to work quickly to gather any remaining evidence while she still had access to the campus and its personnel. As Sarah finally left the library, she felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She had the proof she needed to write a powerful exposé, but she also knew that publishing her findings would trigger a fierce battle with some of the most powerful people in the military establishment. The real test of her courage was just beginning. Sarah spent the night in her quarters analyzing the contents of Captain Rodriguez's flash drive. The evidence was even more damning than she had expected. The files documented dozens of cases spanning 3 years, showing a clear pattern of discrimination and retaliation that reached into every corner of the Academy. The most shocking revelation was a series of email exchanges between General Hayes and his senior staff discussing strategies for managing problematic cadets. The language was carefully coded, but the intent was clear. Female cadets who reported harassment or discrimination were to be systematically undermined until they either withdrew their complaints or left the Academy entirely. One particularly disturbing email from General Hayes to his commandant read, "We cannot allow every minor interpersonal conflict to be elevated to the level of formal complaint. Young people need to learn resilience and the ability to handle difficult situations without running to authority figures. I expect you to ensure that our cadets understand this." Expectation. The message was sent just 2 days after Jennifer Walsh had filed her harassment complaint. Sarah found documentation of at least 15 female cadets who had been forced to leave the Academy over the past 3 years after reporting misconduct. Their academic and physical performance records showed no signs of legitimate deficiencies, but their files contained increasingly harsh evaluations that appeared designed to justify their dismissal. The evidence also revealed how the Academy's legal office worked to protect perpetrators while intimidating victims. Colonel Morrison, whom Sarah had met during her confrontation with the general, had personally intervened to limit investigations and minimize consequences for male cadets accused of harassment or assault. As dawn broke over the Academy grounds, Sarah made a difficult decision. She needed to confront General Hayes directly with some of this evidence to give him an opportunity to respond to the allegations. Journalistic ethics required that she allow the subjects of her investigation to address the charges against them. Even though she expected denial and continued obstruction, she requested an immediate meeting with the general through the proper channels, citing urgent questions related to her assignment. The response came back within an hour. General Hayes would see her at 800 hours, but only with Colonel Morrison present as a witness. The general was clearly preparing for another confrontation. When Sarah arrived at the general's office, she found the same intimidating setup as before. Hayes stood rigidly behind his desk while Morrison positioned himself nearby with a legal pad and recording device. The message was unmistakable. This conversation would be documented and potentially used against her if necessary. Sarah began by presenting some of the less sensitive evidence from the flash drive, focusing on statistical patterns rather than specific cases that might compromise her sources. She showed how female cadets were disproportionately likely to face disciplinary action after filing harassment complaints, and how their academic evaluations suffered dramatically compared to their male counterparts. General Hayes listened with visible irritation as Sarah laid out her findings. When she finished, he dismissed her concerns as the result of misunderstanding normal military discipline and the challenges of integrating women into traditionally male environments. He claimed that some female cadets simply lacked the mental toughness required for military service. The general's response revealed the depth of his bias and the fundamental problems with his leadership philosophy. He spoke about women in the military as if they were experimental subjects, rather than fellow service members deserving equal treatment and respect. His casual dismissal of harassment complaints as interpersonal conflicts showed how little he understood about the seriousness of the issues under his command. Colonel Morrison attempted to redirect the conversation toward technical questions about Sarah's sources and methodology. He challenged her right to access certain types of information and suggested that her reporting violated privacy regulations designed to protect cadets. It was another attempt to intimidate her into backing down from her investigation. Sarah responded by pointing out that she had obtained all of her information through legitimate journalistic practices and had made no attempts to violate anyone's privacy. She emphasized that the public had a right to know about systemic problems in taxpayer-funded institutions, especially those responsible for training future military leaders. The confrontation escalated when Sarah mentioned the email communications between senior staff members regarding strategies for dealing with harassment complaints. General Hayes's face flushed with anger as he realized that someone had provided her with internal documents. He demanded to know who had given her access to confidential materials. Sarah refused to reveal her sources, citing standard journalistic practices and the First Amendment protections for press freedom. She pointed out that the general's primary concern seemed to be identifying whistleblowers rather than addressing the serious problems documented in his own communications. The general stood up abruptly, his military bearing radiating authority and barely controlled rage. He told Sarah that her investigation was based on false premises and driven by an anti-military agenda designed to undermine national security. He accused her of cherry-picking isolated incidents to create a false narrative of systemic problems. Colonel Morrison joined the attack, suggesting that Sarah's reporting could endanger the careers of innocent people and damage the Academy's ability to train effective military officers. He painted her as an outsider who couldn't understand the complexities of military culture and the importance of maintaining unit cohesion. Sarah felt the full weight of their institutional power pressing down on her, but she refused to be intimidated. She reminded them that her job was to report the truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be for those in positions of authority. She pointed out that the real threat to military effectiveness came from covering up problems rather than addressing them. The meeting ended with General Hayes issuing a final warning. He told Sarah that the Academy would no longer cooperate with her investigation and that she should consider her assignment completed. He suggested that she had enough material for her diversity story and should focus on positive aspects of the Academy's programs rather than dwelling on isolated negative incidents. As Sarah gathered her materials to leave, she noticed something different in the general's demeanor. Beneath his anger and bluster, she detected a hint of worry. The evidence she had presented was clearly more extensive and damaging than he had expected, and he was beginning to realize that his usual intimidation tactics might not be sufficient to contain the story. Colonel Morrison escorted Sarah to the door with a final attempt at persuasion. He spoke quietly about the potential consequences of negative publicity for the Academy and the young people whose dreams of military service might be damaged by her reporting. It was a last-ditch appeal to her conscience, hoping that guilt might accomplish what threats had failed to achieve. Walking back across the courtyard, Sarah reflected on how much the atmosphere had changed since her arrival. What had begun as a routine assignment about diversity programs had evolved into a major investigation of institutional corruption and abuse of power. The stakes had escalated dramatically, and she knew that the battle was far from over. Later that morning, Sarah received an urgent phone call from her editor at the newspaper. Someone from the Pentagon had contacted the publisher directly, expressing concerns about her reporting at the Academy. The caller had suggested that her investigation was based on unreliable sources and could damage an important military institution without justification. The pressure from Washington was exactly what Sarah had expected, but it came sooner than she had anticipated. High-ranking military officials were clearly worried about what she might publish, and they were using their political connections to try to kill the story before it could see print. Her editor assured her of the newspaper's support, but warned that they would need ironclad documentation to withstand the inevitable counterattack. Sarah decided to accelerate her timeline and leave the Academy that afternoon. She had gathered enough evidence to write a compelling exposé, and staying longer would only increase the risk of having her access revoked or her materials confiscated. She began packing her belongings while mentally organizing the structure of her story. As she prepared to check out of her guest quarters, there was a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find Jennifer Walsh standing in the hallway, looking nervous but determined. The young cadet had heard through the Academy grapevine that Sarah was leaving, and she wanted to speak with her one final time. Jennifer entered the room and closed the door behind her. She had made a decision that could change the trajectory of her military career, and potentially her entire life. Despite the risks involved, she wanted to go on the record with her story about harassment and retaliation at the Academy. The young cadet explained that watching Sarah stand up to the Academy's leadership had inspired her to find her own courage. She was tired of living in fear and watching other female cadets suffer in silence. She wanted her name attached to the story, even if it meant facing serious consequences from the administration. Sarah was moved by Jennifer's bravery, but concerned about the potential repercussions. Going public with allegations against the Academy would make Jennifer a target for even more severe retaliation. The administration would likely find ways to make her life miserable until she was forced to resign or was dismissed for fabricated reasons. Jennifer acknowledged the risks, but said she was prepared to face them. She had realized that staying silent was not protecting her from harassment and discrimination. It was only enabling the system to continue harming other women. She wanted to use her voice to create change, even if it cost her the military career she had always dreamed of pursuing. As they talked, Jennifer revealed additional details about her experience that she had been too frightened to share during their first conversation. She described how male cadets had made sexually explicit comments about her body and had spread rumors about her supposed sexual activities with instructors. When she reported these incidents, she was told that such behavior was normal military hazing and that she needed to develop thicker skin. The young cadet also shared information about other female cadets who had faced similar treatment. She provided names and specific incidents, creating a broader picture of the hostile environment that women faced throughout their time at the Academy. Many of these women had been too intimidated to speak with Sarah directly, but they had shared their stories with Jennifer in private conversations. Jennifer's decision to go public was driven partly by guilt over her silence while watching other cadets suffer. She described a particularly tragic case of a female cadet who had attempted suicide after facing months of sexual harassment and official indifference to her complaints. The young woman had eventually left the Academy, but not before suffering psychological trauma that would affect her for years to come. Sarah spent an hour with Jennifer, carefully documenting her statements and ensuring that she understood the implications of going on the record. She explained how the newspaper's legal team would work to protect her as much as possible, but cautioned that there were limits to what they could do once the story was published. Jennifer signed a formal statement authorizing Sarah to use her name and quotes in the article. She also provided contact information for several other former cadets who had left the Academy after facing harassment and retaliation. These women were now civilians and might be more willing to speak publicly about their experiences without fear of military discipline. As their conversation concluded, Jennifer made a request that surprised Sarah. She asked if the journalist would be willing to attend her next meeting with the Academy administration, scheduled for the following week. Jennifer believed that having a witness present might prevent the officials from making threats or attempting to coerce her into withdrawing her allegations. Sarah agreed to the request, even though it would mean returning to an increasingly hostile environment. She recognized that Jennifer was taking enormous risks to support the investigation, and the least she could do was provide moral support during what would undoubtedly be a difficult confrontation. Before leaving the academy, Sarah made one final stop at the library to return some research materials. As she walked through the quiet halls, she reflected on how much had changed since her arrival just a week earlier. What had begun as a straightforward assignment had evolved into one of the most important investigations of her career. Captain Rodriguez appeared beside her as she exited the library, moving with the casual precision that marked her as a seasoned military officer. The captain had been watching for an opportunity to speak with Sarah one last time before her departure. She wanted to ensure that the journalist understood the full scope of what she was taking. Commandant Rodriguez explained that the problems at the academy were not isolated incidents but part of a broader culture that existed throughout the military hierarchy. General Hayes was not an anomaly. He was representative of a generation of leaders who viewed women in the military as unwelcome intruders rather than valued colleagues. Changing this mindset would require more than exposing individual cases of misconduct. The captain also warned Sarah about the resources that would be mobilized to discredit her reporting. The military establishment had powerful allies in Congress and the media who would work to minimize the impact of her story. She could expect personal attacks designed to question her credibility and patriotism, along with attempts to characterize her reporting as biased against the military. Rodriguez provided Sarah with contact information for a network of current and former military women who had been documenting discrimination and harassment across multiple branches of service. These women had been waiting for an opportunity to tell their stories to a journalist with the credibility and courage to take on the military establishment. As they prepared to part ways, Captain Rodriguez made a personal request. She asked Sarah to remember that there were many good people in the military who supported equality and justice, but felt powerless to create change from within the system. Her reporting could provide these allies with the external pressure they needed to push for meaningful reforms. Sarah left the academy that afternoon with a sense of purpose that went far beyond her original assignment. She had uncovered evidence of systematic discrimination and abuse that demanded public attention, and she had found sources willing to risk their careers to ensure that the truth was told. The real work was just beginning. During the drive back to her home city, Sarah organized her thoughts and began planning the structure of her exposé. She would need to present the evidence in a way that was both compelling and legally defensible. Knowing that every claim would be scrutinized by lawyers and public relations experts working for the military, the story would require careful balancing between protecting her sources and providing enough detail to demonstrate the scope of the problems at the academy. She would need to corroborate key allegations through multiple sources and documentary evidence, creating an unassailable foundation for her reporting. Sarah also knew that publication of the story would likely trigger a federal investigation and congressional hearings. The political implications were enormous, as the military's handling of gender integration had become a contentious issue in Washington. Her reporting could influence policy decisions that would affect thousands of current and future service members. As she reached her apartment that evening, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had the power to expose injustices that had been hidden from public view, but she also carried the burden of protecting the brave women who had trusted her with their stories. The challenge ahead would test every skill she had developed as an investigative journalist. The phone was already ringing when she walked through her door. Her editor wanted to discuss the growing pressure from Washington and plan their response to the inevitable attempts to suppress the story. The battle lines were being drawn, and Sarah knew that the most difficult part of her investigation was yet to come. Wake up to barista quality coffee with the Brewmaster Coffee Maker. With a single touch, brew the perfect cup every morning, customized to your taste. Sleek, easy to use and designed to make every day a little better. Order now to transform. Why 3 weeks later, Sarah's investigation was published as a front-page exposé that sent shockwaves through the military establishment and the nation's capital. The story detailed systematic discrimination and retaliation at the academy, supported by internal documents and on-the-record statements from victims and witnesses. The evidence was so compelling that even the Pentagon's initial denial seemed hollow and defensive. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans organizations, women's rights groups, and congressional leaders demanded investigations and reforms. Social media exploded with testimonials from current and former military women, sharing their own experiences of harassment and discrimination. The Academy's phone lines were flooded with calls from concerned parents questioning whether their daughters would be safe at the institution. General Hayes found himself at the center of a firestorm that threatened to end his career and tarnish his legacy. The email communications that Sarah had obtained showed his direct involvement in covering up misconduct and retaliating against victims. Military legal experts suggested that his actions might constitute violations of federal law and military regulations that could result in court-martial proceedings. Within days of publication, Jennifer Walsh became a symbol of courage for women throughout the military. Her decision to go on the record had inspired dozens of other victims to come forward with their own stories, creating an avalanche of testimonies that the Pentagon could no longer ignore or dismiss as isolated incidents. But Jennifer also paid a heavy price for her bravery. The Academy administration immediately launched an investigation into her academic performance and conduct record, clearly searching for justifications to dismiss her. The harassment from male cadets intensified, with some leaving threatening messages and vandalizing her personal belongings. Captain Rodriguez faced her own consequences for supporting the investigation. Although her identity as a source had been protected, the Academy leadership suspected her involvement and began scrutinizing her every action. She was passed over for a promotion she had been expecting and received a negative performance evaluation that would likely end her hopes of advancing to higher ranks. The political pressure in Washington became intense as senators and representatives demanded accountability from military leadership. Congressional hearings were scheduled to examine not just the Academy's problems but broader issues of gender integration throughout the armed forces. The Secretary of Defense was forced to testify about systemic failures in addressing harassment and discrimination. Ray received death threats and accusations of being unpatriotic for exposing military misconduct. Conservative media personalities attacked her credibility and suggested that her reporting was part of a liberal agenda to weaken American defense capabilities. But she also received messages of support from military families grateful that someone had finally shed light on problems they had long suspected but couldn't prove. Investigation expanded as other journalists and government agencies began examining similar problems at military installations across the country. Sarah's reporting had opened a floodgate that revealed the scope of discrimination and harassment throughout the armed forces, forcing a national reckoning with how women were treated in military environments. General Hayes requested a meeting with Sarah 6 months after her story was published. The Pentagon was conducting its own investigation into the Academy's problems, and congressional pressure had made his position increasingly untenable. His lawyers had advised him that cooperation with ongoing investigations might help mitigate the consequences he faced. Sarah agreed to meet with the general at a neutral location away from the Academy. She was curious about what he might have to say after months of denying the problems documented in her reporting. The meeting was arranged through his legal counsel, with strict agreements about what could and could not be discussed. When Sarah arrived at the downtown hotel conference room, she found a very different man than the rigid, authoritative figure she had encountered at the Academy. General Hayes looked older and more worn, as if the weight of the scandal had physically aged him. His military bearing remained, but the arrogance and dismissiveness were gone. The general began by acknowledging that serious problems had existed at the Academy under his leadership. He stopped short of admitting personal responsibility for creating or maintaining the hostile environment. But he conceded that his administration had failed to protect female cadets from harassment and discrimination. Hayes explained that he had grown up in a military where women played limited roles, and he had struggled to adapt to the changing expectations of gender integration. He claimed that his actions had been motivated by a desire to maintain military effectiveness, rather than deliberate malice toward women, but he recognized that the impact had been devastating regardless of his intentions. The conversation took an unexpected turn when the general asked Sarah about Jennifer Walsh's current situation. The young cadet had managed to survive the retaliation campaign and was still enrolled at the academy, but her experience had clearly taken a toll on her physical and emotional health. Hayes seemed genuinely concerned about her welfare, though Sarah wondered if his interest was motivated by legal concerns rather than personal remorse. As the meeting progressed, Sarah realized that the general was fundamentally asking for her opinion on how he might begin to make amends for the damage he had caused. He spoke about establishing new programs to support female cadets and implementing stricter policies against harassment and retaliation. But his suggestions seemed superficial, focused more on managing public relations than addressing the underlying cultural problems. Sarah listened to his proposals with skepticism, remembering the arrogant officer who had refused to acknowledge her as an equal during their first encounter. The transformation was dramatic, but she questioned whether it represented genuine change or simply adaptation to new political realities. The general had spent decades building a career based on maintaining traditional military hierarchies, and such fundamental beliefs were not easily altered. The meeting concluded with an unexpected moment that would stay with Sarah for years to come. As they prepared to leave, General Hayes stood and faced her directly. For the first time in their relationship, he offered her a formal military salute, holding the position until she acknowledged the gesture with a nod. The symbolism was powerful and complex. The general, who had initially refused to show her basic respect, was now offering the highest form of military acknowledgement. But Sarah understood that the salute was not really about her. It was about the women whose stories she had told and the changes they had forced throughout the military establishment. As Sarah walked away from that final meeting, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. Her investigation had exposed serious problems and sparked important reforms, but it had also revealed how difficult it was to change institutional cultures built on decades of tradition and bias. The work of creating true equality would continue. Long after the headlines faded and the political attention moved to other issues, the 6 words that had left the general, saluting her in silence, were not spoken aloud, but their meaning was clear in his gesture. "You were right, and I was wrong." It was an acknowledgement that came too late for many of the women who had suffered under his leadership, but it represented hope that future generations of female service members might face fewer barriers in their pursuit of military careers. Our mornings.